Thank you, Professor Murthy, for those very kind words. This morning, as I came in a little earlier, I had a chance to have breakfast with Professor Murthy and also Shubhra Verma, the daughter of Justice Verma. And it was for me a very pleasant and a very warm sort of meeting to be able to understand a little bit about the personal life of Justice Verma, what he stood for, how he lived, his principles, his firmness, his dedication to human rights and independence of the judiciary and so on. And I wish I had met Justice Verma properly, because by the time I came to practice in the Supreme Court in 2000, Justice Verma had retired. His reputation, of course, looms over all of us, but I didn't get the chance to meet him and interact with him as many lawyers in Delhi had. And I lost that chance, but I did meet him once at his residence in Noida, along with some other friends. And he was very soft-spoken, very courteous, very concerned about the human rights development in the country. And I took a picture away with me of a very kind and generous man. All of you know of Vishaka, of course, but I don't know whether you realize not just the national implication of Vishaka, but the huge international repercussions that Vishaka had worldwide. And wherever you travel to the American university, you travel to UK, you go to a European university, and you speak of public interest litigation and the rule of law, and judges and professors will invariably come up and talk to you about Vishaka. Some of them approvingly, most of them approvingly, some of them a little disapprovingly. And they ask, how can you judges do these things? How can judges in India start virtually making the law? And they'll tell you about the separation of powers. They understand it in a very narrow way. We in India understand it much more broadly. We understand it better. The judges must remain within their limits. Making a law on sexual harassment is like legislating. And so very interesting discussions have taken place, I must tell you, over the last many, many years. And I think India truly, and Justice Verma's judgment in Vishaka truly went down a different path and opened up the roads for judicial intervention for the enforcement of human rights. The answer was very simple. You must understand separation of powers in the context of the country in which you made the judgment. And in developing countries, you will find governance weak, corruption going on all the time, and you find fragmentation of administration. What is a court supposed to do when they find human rights are violated and you find the executive not responding at all? What will you do? Will you cite separation of powers and say, I'm sorry, litigant, Mr. Petitioner, Miss Petitioner, I'm sorry, we can't do a thing because we have separation of powers. And if you want food, if you want housing, if you want education, you have to go to the executive. You can't come to us. We can't do these things. We only interpret the law. And the law was then clarified and amplified, you might say, that the ultimate protector of the Constitution is the court. The ultimate protector of human rights is the Constitution. Who implements the Constitution and enforces human rights? It's the court. The court will defer to the executive, give you the first chance to provide people with their basic rights, give you another chance, remind you again, But when the executive remains unmoved and doesn't care about human rights implementation in the country, the courts will not sit back. The courts will get in and direct the executive to do what it should have done in the first place. And it opened the doors. Vishaka opened the doors for litigation on a whole range of issues, and for the courts to intervene to ensure that human rights are protected. And now it's many years after Vishaka. I think the whole world agrees that Vishaka was correct, and that notions of separation of powers must change with the times. And they must certainly change in accordance with the countries in which they are delivered. And developing countries is a large part of the globe. And everywhere where administration disintegrates, where the executive is ineffective, the expanded power of the court to intervene and do justice steps in. Because of the enormous generation of public interest jurisprudence, you young lawyers are lucky to be in India. I remember many, many years ago, I was given a chance to go and practice in America, study in America and then practice in America. And even then I knew, because even then public interest litigation had been quite spoken of and practiced in Indian courts. And I thought to myself, I do so many cases in the Bombay High Court where I was then. I can do so many things in my High Court for justice. And I talked to American lawyers and I found that some of them, if they're lucky, go to the Supreme Court maybe once or twice or thrice in their lives. And here in Delhi, we go to the Supreme Court maybe for 5, 6 cases a day. And you look at the litigation here, you look at the scope of litigation, you look at how judges are changing society around them. And you look at the litigation in the developed world and you realize that you have opportunities here in India which you will never get anywhere else in the world. It is truly a place where, if you are a young lawyer and you want to make change, you can make change in India by yourself. It's all right. I came to Delhi. I had no father or godfather in the profession. I was an engineer first. I went to IIT Bombay and graduated as an engineer. I sort of grew up in a period of great turmoil. The emergency, the Jai Prakash movement for total revolution, the great railway strike where George Fernandez led the workers on a strike against Indira Gandhi and the Congress government, the great textile strike in Bombay where over 1 million workers struck work for justice and proper wages, treatment with dignity, and so on. I grew up in a very tumultuous period. So for youngsters like me then, it was very normal to think in political terms of revolution, insurrection, uprising, transforming society. Many of us were young Che Guevaras who pretended or thought they could change the world just by themselves. They didn't need any help, they can change the world just by themselves. And it's a wonderful way to live, it's a wonderful way to be. The confidence of a young person to say, I can change the world around me, and I don't need to look over my shoulder and see if somebody is coming to support me. I don't need any support. Like Che Guevara and his band of Fidel Castro and others, I can go out into the world and crush injustice wherever I see it. It's a wonderful way of thinking. It's a little utopian, a little too optimistic. But being utopian and optimistic is the characteristic of the young. And if you're not utopian and over-optimistic when you're young, you'll be quite a boring person when you're old. But politics was part of our learning. Social change, the study of society, study of history, study of philosophy. Why do you live? What is the purpose of life? What is the purpose of living? And is it innate in every person? Is it innate that you want to do good for people and change the world for people? These were the issues that came up with the young in that period. And I remember when the railway strike took place, and Indira Gandhi ordered that all the workmen be thrown out of their quarters. And at midnight, their bags and baggages and people with families were asked to get out of the railway quarters. And George Fernandez was fighting for the railway workmen. We as students went out into the colonies and tried to help people and tried to mobilize and speak at factory gates and so on. It was truly a wonderful time. Today, things are very different. Today, you find young people, and I suspect many of you, very atomized and fragmented. Not sure what to do, where to go, apart from taking up jobs at corporate houses and so on, not knowing. What is your role in society? People are so afraid. People are afraid to think, people are afraid to act. Your parents will counsel you against acting. They'll say, don't be foolish. You'll get into trouble. It's a very different environment in which I speak to you today. And I want to tell you of some of the very exciting periods, very exciting judgments, some awful and terrible judgments, and the swings in the law that have taken place. And end with the situation in which you are today, and the magnificent things that you can do, notwithstanding the situation of terror around you. Even in this brief period of the last few years, you've seen the power of the Supreme Court. You saw it in the 377 judgment, the piracy judgment, the triple talaq judgment, and so many decisions. But in a very short period, you've seen a flurry of constitutional bench decisions that have changed the situation around you. For the 377 judgment, I must tell you, the credit goes to one of the finest judges India has ever had, Justice A.P. Shah. From my High Court, from the Bombay High Court, where I had the pleasure of appearing before him, an extraordinary man, an extraordinary judge, who was not taken to the Supreme Court in deplorable circumstances. And I say special mention today, I say this today, and I especially mention Justice Shah, because he stood for all that was good in the judiciary: bravery, honesty, integrity, and a concern for the poor. When I spoke to Shubhra this morning and when I spoke to some of my friends, Justice Verma was that. Integrity, honesty, firmness, Gujarat riots and so on, firmness. And above all, a compassion for the poor. This was the tradition that judges had. This was the tradition that lawyers had, rapidly disintegrating. And this is the tradition of students also rapidly disintegrating and being replaced by other kind of values and things like that. I left IIT Bombay, joined the slum dwellers movement, I did very unorthodox things, and I'll tell you just a small part of that and get on with it. And then joined Datta Samant, who was a militant trade unionist, 1 million workers in his group. I remember the meetings with the whole Maidan full, or maybe 500,000, 750,000 workers. Can you imagine? At a time when the workers were very terribly exploited, and Datta Samant stood up for them. And ironically, I'm a lawyer today, but I started my career with a man who didn't believe in the use of the law, and correctly so. The labor courts and the industrial tribunals were giving workers petty awards. After 10 years of litigation, you'll get a 500, 400 rupee wage increase. And Dr. Samant would say, leave these courts. Come to me. Fight on the streets. And he did it. And the workers got wage increases of 5,000, 7,000, 10,000 rupees. Can you imagine in those days? But the most important thing, and this is the message for you young students, the most important thing, he taught me to look at the world through the eyes of a working class person. You come from affluent families, I presume, many of you, most of you. You come from families that have never experienced suffering, many of you. So the most important thing in law and life is to be able to take your narrow, blinkered vision and expand and see the world as it is. And every person in his life or her life will always get a guru who will pass you by. You may not recognize her or him. You may even be scornful of her or him. But I think life gives you one guru. And if you recognize that this is a person, he is not saying very great things about me, but he's saying some very important things, the guru will expand your vision of the world and change the way you live and change the way you work. So I had one guru, Dr. Datta Samant, who showed me how to look at the world through the eyes of the working class person. And I've kept that little gift with me. It was a permanent gift that he gave me. I kept that permanent gift with me for the rest of my life. And in all my work, in all my meetings, in all my lectures, in everything that I do, I am able to give an answer. I'm able to see things. I'm able to articulate something through the eyes of the working class people, through the eyes of the poor. If you get that vision, you will understand repression, you will understand terror, you will understand discrimination, and then as lawyers you will understand how to combat repression using the tool that you have, which is the law. India is a very beautiful country. I love the country. I love working in it. I told you I got a chance with a particular foundation to ship to America, and I would get a good amount of money and training and so on. But there's nothing like India. It is such a beautiful country despite everything. Its people, its music, its culture, its beauty. But there is another side to India, and I want to look at that for the time being. India is a savage and brutal country. The largest democracy in the world, very proud of its democracy, very proud of its traditions and heritage and history that goes back years and years. But if you look at India today from the point of view of a human rights lawyer, it is a very brutal and savage country, and it is a very uncivilized country. Acid attacks, caste violence, lynching, marital rape, torture, executions, disappearances, malnutrition, ill health, illiteracy, just to name a few. It's incredible that you can have a country with a growth rate, as the government says, of 7% GDP, and yet have the levels of deprivation and brutality that you have in India. These are the areas in which a human rights lawyer gets into. These are the areas in which litigation takes place. The task is enormous. The work to be done is gigantic. People say that human rights lawyers are a tributary, a tiny stream, and the mainstream of law is property rights, suits, income tax, excise, all that kind of stuff, intellectual property rights, corporate law. That's the mainstream, we are told. And human rights is a little tributary on the side. But if you look at it, one big area of human rights law is criminal law. Huge area for intervention, and many of our young lawyers work in the criminal courts doing extraordinary work. Family law, huge. Labor law, huge. Environmental law, disability law, atrocity law, Dalit sense, human rights law, and so on. If you look at the number of cases in human rights litigation, it is probably 100 times, 200 times, 500 times more than normal commercial litigation. With that many number of lawyers actually doing this kind of work. And if you look at the opportunities for developing the law and making the law, it's incredible. Take farmers' rights, genetically modified organisms. Right? Monsanto coming into the country with genetically modified food. Right? Starting all kinds of patents over seeds and so on. Look at any branch of these human rights branches, and you will see cutting-edge law being developed. I just gave you the example of one line, which is genetically modified organizations and food, the link with organic food, the link to a new world where pesticides and genetics will not interfere with what you eat. It is such a huge area of law. The whole world is moving towards organic food, free of chemicals, anti-GMO. And India is going straight into that, spreading genetically modified organizations throughout India, with the largest consumption of toxic pesticides in the world on the food that you eat. So you can imagine the level of cases that exist and the enormity of the legal work that is remaining to be done. India is a repressive state and country. And I want to start now with the second emergency. The first emergency in the Supreme Court was the ADM Jabalpur case, where some of our finest judges betrayed us. Finest judges. If you look at the judges who delivered that judgment, and you look at their long history of serving the nation, serving the judiciary, and you come to think, how did these judges make such a terrible blunder that they upheld the declaration of emergency? What was it in their nature? What was it in their thinking that caused such incredible judges to make such a huge blunder? That the declaration of emergency was upheld by these judges. So that was the big first emergency case, the ADM Jabalpur case. The second happened not a very long time ago, perhaps a year ago. The Bhima Koregaon case. the Romila Thapar case, where some of our finest lawyers working for the poor in the country for decades were arrested. I know all of them. I know all of them for a long, long time. Sudha Bharadwaj, Surendra Gadling, know all of them. And the investigation officer comes out with charges which are like fairy tales. When you take a lawyer and arrest a lawyer, right, it must be something serious. Did you throw a bomb? Did you fire a gun? Did you stab somebody? Did you take a huge amount of money from some country abroad and give it to some subversives in the country? And you look at it, it's like a fairy tale. Somebody had a letter like this delivered, unsigned. Okay, but what's it got to do with me? I remember Binayak Sen's case. He was a personal friend of mine. Many of you may not even remember the names I speak of. Binayak Sen was a young doctor in Chhattisgarh, working with the poor. Well-known, well-reputed doctor. He went to jail to treat somebody, and he was arrested on the ground that he took a letter from that person and delivered it to somebody else. 25, 30, 40 years of service to the country, and he's arrested and put in jail. And charged with sedition, which is akin to waging war against the state and trying to overthrow the state by unlawful means. And I remember when Binayak Sen's case came to the High Court, bail was rejected, trial court first rejected bail, High Court rejected bail, and matter came to Supreme Court. And I remember the justice saying to the prosecution, tell me, if everything you say in your charge sheet is right, if I accept every word of your charge sheet, where is the sedition? Because it was so, the charges were so flimsy, so fanciful, so in the air, so vague, so obscure. Because sedition and waging war ultimately is rising up against the state by violent means. What did this man, Binayak Sen, who was a total non-violent campaigner, what was he doing in jail for a year, 2 years maybe? It was horrifying to see my friend put in that circumstance. It is horrifying to see Surendra Gadling, my dear friend from Nagpur, who fought cases all his life nicely, with courage, being taken for what? And Sudha Bharadwaj, one of the most well-known lawyers in this country, put in for what? And the troubling thing is now, when you learn criminal law, you'll not learn all this, so in a sense your teachers have to change with the times. Prosecutions today are not like prosecutions of the old. The way in which criminal justice is delivered in the country today is very different from criminal justice delivered in the country 20, 30 years ago. You've learned things like the prosecution should be fair, the prosecution should disclose everything that they have, even if it favors the accused, and all these fanciful ideas. But today's prosecution is not like that at all. Today's policemen and investigating officers will do exactly what their political master tells them. I want to have this person in jail, get it done. And then they'll fabricate cases and fabricate stories. And so when the case came to the Supreme Court, you had a majority judgment and you had a minority judgment. The majority judgment goes the usual route, as if India has not changed at all. We are still living in the social democratic periods of the 80s and 90s, where policemen were fair, where governments were fair, where the policemen would not lie so blatantly, and so on and so forth. And the majority judgment says, well, it requires investigation and so on and so forth. It requires to be looked in. We can't release him on bail, we're sorry. And the minority judgment says, this is a question of liberty. These are well-known people. They have served the country well. I'm being a bit liberal with the actual wording of the judgment. They were charged with many cases and acquitted. The police told us that we want to keep them in custody because they planned an attack on the Prime Minister of India. If that was so, my friends, they would be justified, keep them in jail. And then it turns out later when they are questioned, where is the charge really? You told the whole country that there were people who were plotting an attack on the Prime Minister. And when we look at the records and we ask you, where is that charge? And then you candidly tell us, so sorry, sir, that's not the charge against them. Can you imagine? Can you imagine police telling the country, these are subversives planning to attack the Prime Minister, when actually there is no charge against them of that? And the court draws attention to the fact that they've been acquitted in so many cases. The court draws attention to the fact that the policemen are carrying on a parallel trial before the media, saying all kinds of things about these people, slandering them, defaming them before the public. And the conclusion of the court was that a perusal of the record shows that the police have been a little, what was the phrase used, taking liberties with the truth. And the minority judgment said, I would appoint an SIT. I would take this investigation out of the hands of the Maharashtra police. I would give it to an SIT. And I would have a court-monitored SIT with reports coming to the court every 4 weeks. Now pause and think of the enormity of this case, the importance of this case. After many years, you have a judgment akin to ADM Jabalpur. ADM Jabalpur said if people are arrested, even if that arrest was wrong, you cannot challenge it in court. Here you have the arrest of prominent persons from civil society, and the court allowing those arrests to continue and the incarceration to continue. It is the beginning of the new emergency in India. It is a warning sign for all of us. When you study criminal law now, when you study law in your college, when you open and read the papers, when you read of Indira Jaisingh being arrested, an old friend of mine that I know from Bombay days, what a superb lawyer. She taught all of us how to use the law for the poor. And Anand Grover, her partner. When you have lawyers like that who are the beacon lights for change in the profession, being taken because their views are politically opposed to the views of the state. They are political opponents of the state. They are legal opponents of the state. You know that you are getting into very difficult times. Why should you think about all this at all? Why bother? If dark times are coming, as Colin says, why should you bother? You've got your life ahead of you, you'll get your degree, you'll get a nice job, you'll get a pretty good salary. Why should you bother? you should bother. Because even outside the law, things are happening in this country, which by the time you graduate or by the time you get your jobs, certain events will unfold. If any of you think that our lives are going to be like our lives of our fathers, they had decent lives, they got a degree, they went abroad, they came back, they joined companies and so on, or they joined the government and so on. I think maybe times are going to be different, and I think perhaps you better start thinking now. Whatever indications there are of the economy, it looks as if India is now in very dire straits. The bank unions for whom I appear tell me that the banking system is on the brink of a huge crisis. And you must know that if you or your parents have put in 1 crore or 2 crores or 5 crores in the banks in fixed deposits or whatever, if a bank crashes, you are insured to the tune of 1 lakh. Countries have gone through it recently. Russia went through a huge collapse of its banking system. Greece went through a collapse of its system. Is India on the verge of a new kind of big economic crisis? Huge economic crisis. And if that is so, and nobody tells you about it, none of the media houses will tell you, because so they're owned by corporates, almost all of them. Almost every one of them are owned by corporations today. If the politicians don't tell you and say it's business as usual. I remember a home minister saying when the earlier crisis took place, some 10 years ago, he came on television and advised everybody, please don't worry, go to the gym as usual. I want all of you to carry on with your lives. I want you to go to the gym as usual. Nobody tells you what's really happening in India. Nobody is telling you that capitalists and so on are taking out huge amounts of money. Nobody is telling you that their sons and daughters are planning to leave India and go abroad. Nobody is telling you that there's a flight of capital from India abroad. Nobody is telling you about a huge bankruptcy in companies. And the ever-growing number of cases that are going into liquidation or going before the insolvency tribunal. Nobody is telling you all these things. So my dear friends, I want you to think differently. Jindal is a lovely place to be in, and it's a lovely atmosphere to be in. And it's nice that you are secluded from the hustle and bustle of the world, because you get a time to be young and chat and talk about things and debate. You get a little seclusion from the rest of the world. But with that seclusion comes complacency also. And you must listen very carefully to what the other side is saying. Not the government and the government, cronies and all that. You must listen to what the other side is saying. And it is not a period where you can simply follow the instructions of your parents or your elders and not think for yourself and do exactly as they say. This is not the time. This is a time not only in India but globally for upheaval and change. You go to France and see the turmoil in France and the agitations and the demonstrations. You go to Hong Kong and you see the demonstrations. You go right across the world and you'll see the young are in ferment and society is in crisis, and the old capitalist system is failing to deliver. You have to think, like we say in law, from first principles. You have to get out of all this rhetoric and cliche and the advice of the old and think from first principles. And judge for yourself as to where you are going and what it is you want to do. The state as terror is a very new aspect of the current period. We talk about terrorists, and indeed there are terrorists. Coming from Pakistan into Kashmir, there are terrorists. There are terrorists in the country. There are terrorists of all ideological hues. There are terrorists having different religious persuasions. But there is one terrorist of them all who's quite a big terrorist, which society is a little timid and apprehensive about speaking about. The state as terrorist. It has gone on for too long. It must stop now. And we must truly have a liberal democratic state where agencies of the state are not permitted to engage in the kind of terrorism that we accuse other terrorist organizations of. Take the AFSPA judgments of the Supreme Court. I want all of you to do a little search on your computers. The case taken out by the wives and widows of the disappeared in Manipur, where you may be quite surprised to hear the figure, 1,500 plus young men disappeared or were disappeared by the security forces over a period of 25 years. Who would touch this case? Which court had the courage to take it up? You read about it in the papers every day. You saw televised clippings of people being killed by security forces in broad daylight, coming on television. Which court would take it up? Which litigant had the temerity to take up these cases? Which judge had the strength to take up a case against the security forces? Nobody. Nobody. Can you imagine the condition of, imagine a family. Imagine a family. Early morning, the security forces surround your house. You and your husband are in bed. They grab him, take him out, take him a little distance, shoot him dead. Can you imagine the abject fear of the families? The state is terror. And I must say the Supreme Court reacted remarkably in the case. Remarkable judgment. There is no impunity for a person in uniform. If you kill a person in cold blood, you'll be prosecuted like any ordinary person. And the court ordered the setting up of a special investigation team by the CBI for the investigation and prosecution of policemen and other security forces for engaging in these crimes. It is not a judgment that a court would give easily, let me tell you that. Today, it is not the culture in our courts to take big people to task, particularly the police and security forces. But this was an extraordinary judgment delivered by the Supreme Court in Manipur. Now look at the effect. Manipur saw 300 killings a year. More than that perhaps, minimum 300 killings a year. The moment the judgment came, killings in Manipur went from 300 to 3. So the intervention by lawyers and the intervention by judges in a situation of injustice and terror has an immediate calming effect on the population. All that you need is for lawyers to show courage. All that you need is for civil society to show courage. And all that it needs is for the judge to show courage. Because the Constitution is there, the system is there, the precedents are there. Everything is there. All you need is courage. That's all. And I remember I was called for a meeting at Gurgaon where there's a club. And I went for the meeting and I suddenly found that these were all army officers sitting there. And their wives. This is after the judgment. And I said, okay, I'm in for a bit of trouble today. And a woman stood up and said, my husband fought in Kargil. The forces are there in Siachen. They're in the cold. They don't have jackets to wear. And you, Mr. Gonsalves, you're finding fault with them. You human rights people are finding fault with them. I listened carefully. Because to an extent, there's a kernel of truth in what she was saying. Or what she was feeling. And I thought it's best to take on or confront or deal with the sentiments that she was sharing with me. And I said, ma'am, I think I must tell you what the case is all about. Human rights people are not opposed to the army at all. We believe and we know that the army is there to protect the country for our interests. We have the highest respect and the highest regard for the army. So too the police, although we believe that the police has become quite rotten now with the influence of politicians and others, but we have the highest regard. And ma'am, may I tell you that if there is a terrorist who points his gun at the security forces and the army officer turns around and shoots him dead, he would be perfectly justified under the law of self-defense in doing so. And if you ask a human rights activist to put a medal on the chest of an army officer for fighting to save this country, please call us and we'll be happy to pin. We'll be honored to pin a medal on the chest of an army officer who's fighting to save this country. Let there be no two thinking about this. But, madam, our case is about people in uniform picking up a person, taking that person to the barracks, torturing him for days, then shooting him dead, throwing his body in a jungle, and then saying or pretending that he was killed in an encounter. Our case is only about that. Killing in cold blood by people in uniform. Rogue elements who believe that they have a gun and a uniform, therefore they can torture and kill a person in custody. That is all that our case is. And I like that interaction. I benefited from that interaction. And I think the persons who were there also benefited from the interaction. And I heard an army officer say, actually, Mr. Gonsalves, you're right. If we don't get rid of these rogue elements, it will be like a cancer inside us. We must get rid of them. We must have absolute integrity in our operations. And we must abide by the law in all respects. That was the aspirants. I now want to tell you about sedition and the cancer of sedition. In old English times, to talk against the king, off with your head. Capital punishment, you spoke against the king. Even if you said something innocuous like, I think this king is quite an idiot, he doesn't know how to rule. Off with your head. Then the sedition law went right across the world. The UK repealed it, all the countries repealed sedition law. But in India, we keep this provision on our statute. 271A IPC. But in India, we diluted the law. It shouldn't be there at all, because it's capable of ambiguous interpretation. And the Supreme Court judgment in Kedarnath also, the constitution met, is a little wishy-washy here and there. But ultimately, Supreme Court judgments clarify the law. You can say whatever you want, because 19(1)A of the Constitution permits you to say whatever you want, obnoxious, hurtful, as long as you don't back it up with actions to overthrow the state. If I say something and they are empty words, it is not a crime. If I say something and back it up, to wage war against the state, to overthrow the state, it is a heinous crime, attracting the most severe sentence. So you had a case in Punjab where a person came out onto the streets and said, Khalistan Zindabad. I think almost all of you will say, if I were to ask you, yes, this is sedition. Khalistan Zindabad. And his case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court judges asked the prosecution, after saying Khalistan Zindabad, something so terrible as secession, break away from India and all that sort of stuff, did he do anything? Did he throw a bomb? Did he shoot anybody? Did he mobilize people and, break this and break? They said, no, sir, he made a speech and went away. And the Supreme Court said, I'm sorry, in the absence of an overt act, this is not sedition. And in Srinagar, you had a person who said, similar case, he came out into the chowk at Srinagar and said, we must raise an army of people and arm them and get freedom from India. Sounds obnoxious to most of you. Sounds terrible. Sounds punishable. And there are many in this country, I would say, roughly 70% of the general public confronted with this Khalistan and independence and all that would say, put him in jail for the rest of his life, or shoot him. Views in society are very extreme. Views in Indian society are terrible, really terrible. And again they asked, did he do anything after that? After saying we should have an army of people and fight for independence, he didn't do anything. He was acquitted. But today across the country there would be thousands of cases. You do a little cartoon, sedition. You have a poster saying that there should be mobilization for freedom, there should be poster. There should be prosecution. Kanhaiya said, I want freedom, Azadi. You've heard that speech on YouTube? Have you heard the speech on YouTube? Please go, it's a wonderful education. Azadi, sedition. And then he said, what am I asking for? Am I asking for a separate country? I want Azadi from caste. I want Azadi from class. I want Azadi from hunger. I want Azadi from ill health and illiteracy. I want Azadi from this kind of rule of the capitalist. I want socialism. I want freedom. I want that kind of Azadi. So they can't figure out how to prosecute Kanhaiya for the slogan of Azadi. Then you have in Jharkhand, are any of you here from Jharkhand? You have the Patal Khari cases. Tribal self-rule, where the tribals are fed up. All across the country, tribals are fed up with governments, evicting them from their homeland. Corporations coming in and doing mining. In Chhattisgarh, they kill the tribals, rape the women, rob their chickens, burn their houses. Tribals are fed up. So in Patal Khari, they said, the Constitution speaks of Panchayati Raj. The Constitution speaks of the Gram Sabha as supreme. Those at the village level, those at the Gram Sabha will run the country and run the land. So we are announcing self-rule. We are going to do self-rule in our areas. We don't want Aadhaar because our identity is Patal Khari. This is our identity, we don't want your Aadhaar. And they said, which was documented on a Facebook post, we are going to have Gram Sabha banks throughout our area. We don't want all this government interfering, we'll have Gram Sabha banks. And now there's a case filed against them in Jharkhand for this sentence. हमें आधार नहीं चाहिए. Our identity is Patal Khari. And we are going to have Gram Sabha banks throughout the country, and the sedition cases have been filed against them. The terror of the state. The state as terrorist is a subject never taught in any university or college, but it is a huge area of human rights intervention. And it is something, as a young student, if your heart is troubled, if your mind is dissatisfied, if you don't want to go on the routine path and become a cog in the machine somewhere, or run around behind senior lawyers holding their briefs and never arguing all your life, if you want a different path for yourself, these are areas of work that you should do. I have very little time because I think I've gone past my quite a bit. But let me just do one thing and then end. One thing. Because it's contemporary. You've seen the NRC debates and so on, right? The National Register of Citizens. And you've seen the turmoil in the country. Right or wrong? You can even presume it to be wrong. People came in 4 or 5 decades ago. They came in, they settled down, they had children, they had grandchildren, they bought land, they tilled the land, they opened shops, they took jobs. 50 years later, we're telling them to get up and go. Bangladesh says these are not our citizens, so they become stateless. And they are governed by the UN Convention Against Statelessness, which says that no state should ever create a situation of statelessness, where no country will accept them. Now India has created this. It was not necessary to create, but India has created a crisis of its own making. They can neither stay here with safety nor can they go anywhere else in the world. Stateless persons are covered by the convention. They cannot be put in jail. They cannot be deprived of any of the basic human rights. Education, health, housing, and so on. The rights of citizens extend to stateless persons. Why did you do this exercise when you knew that Bangladesh would never take them back? No answer. No answer. On all the debates that I'm on television, I asked them, sir, I agree with you. They came in illegally, let me assume, 40, 50 years ago. What are you going to do with them? And if you can't do anything with them, why did you enter this exercise in the first place? And I must point out now, because the point I'm trying to make is, I mentioned a lot of very good Supreme Court decisions. But this is, and I want to end on this note, there is a turn in the trust of Supreme Court judgments now. And I hope it doesn't continue. But in the NRC case, it started with Sonowal's case, where judges said, migrants coming into India are like an enemy invasion. Soon they will ask for a certain part of Assam to be broken and merged with Bangladesh. Very inflammable language, very wrong language, very slanted language. Migrants are migrants. They didn't come here to have India part of Bangladesh. Not possible. They didn't come here as an invasion. They came here after the Bangladesh war, or the poverty and misery. They came in large numbers too. Indians have been the biggest migrant population right across the world. We've gone illegally, we've gone on boats, we've gone in containers, we've gone in trucks. We are incredibly innovative. Millions of Indian migrants have gone right across the world, successfully situated, rehabilitated, rose in the ranks of that society, became leaders of society, became ministers in those governments. What's the matter? It's simple migration worldwide. But when it comes to India, enemy invasion, what would an Indian think if an Indian were abroad and somebody said, you bloody Indians are invading our country? Because we know, we bloody Indians, when we invaded their country, we did so much good for that country. We brought talent, we brought hard work, we brought ethics and values to that country, isn't it? So I'm giving you this last example of the NRC just for you to understand that the Supreme Court today is sometimes brilliant and sometimes very lost. And you can see young lawyers now. These are your friends. You might know them. There's a whole generation of young lawyers who are writing in the papers, coming on television, writing on the internet, very erudite articles on law. Very. And that is a sign of the new times. The bad times are upon us in terms of terror. But in every situation of terror, there are sparks of change, beacon lights of change. And that is the optimistic angle to our work. The four great elements of terror today, one was the NRC, the second is eviction of tribals from forests. Years ago in Jindal, the Supreme Court said, clear the forest of encroachers. How was this interpreted by the forest guards? Encroachers, it's tribals. Tens and thousands of tribals were killed. In Assam, the forest guards rode on elephants and crushed the houses of the tribals. In Kashmir, the pellet gun, which is used against people. Now you've read about it, right? From one shot, 200, maybe more pellets hit you in the body. Cases going on for a long, long time in the courts. Courts not taking it seriously. The argument is so simple. The pellet gun goes in a cone. You fire from here, you aim at person A, and the girl sitting up on the first floor of a house will get hit in the eye. What does the UN say? These are proscribed weapons. These are banned weapons. Why? Because any weapon that is indiscriminate is proscribed. As simple as that. Hundreds of people, hundreds of children. Some have been killed, some have been blinded by the use of a weapon of terror. And so my dear friend, let me end now, because I've gone way above. With a piece of advice. I think there are very dark times coming. I think these times will test your strength as a young person. Whether you're a person with some mental strength inside you, or you're just run-of-the-mill and you'll do what everybody says you must do. Whether you have a feeling of right and wrong inside you, or you will go with what everybody says you must do. And there will be many like that. I think the majority will be like that because our education system has been like that. But whatever it is, I will give you one piece of advice, which something that I did when I was young. The best teacher is India. And to go to that teacher, you must travel the length and breadth of this country. And I'm not talking about hiking up the hills in fancy shoes and in fancy cars. I'm talking about really going to the depth of this country. It is a great teacher. Go to the area where 300,000 farmers have committed suicide over 25 years. The farmer suicide areas. You go to those areas, talk to the people, sit among them, do a little fact-finding, prepare a public interest case, and understand what tragedy it is that farmers are forced to take their own lives in such dark conditions. Go to the places where the farmers are fighting genetically modified organisms, and you will understand the terrible things that are going to happen to the food that you consume and the food that your children consume. And you will understand why sickness and illness, even in the middle classes and the rich, is rising, and why cancer is such a scourge. That there will be no family which does not know a victim of cancer amongst them, including young people dying of cancer. The scourge of pesticides and the scourge of GMOs. Go to the areas where there is a water crisis for you to understand that India will be suffering the greatest convulsions because of lack of drinking water. You just have to go to Chennai to understand a city without water. And when I went to Nagpur recently to go to the High Court, Nagpur city, one of the main cities of Maharashtra, is getting water every second day. And climate change. And starvation deaths. Country with 8% GDP and people dying of starvation in the country on a large scale. My dear friends, India is really ripe for revolution. You may, while you listen to this, scoff a little bit in your minds. It is ripe for social change. It is ripe for unrest of a positive kind. It is ripe for resistance. It is ripe for rebellion. It is ripe for revolution. And it will come sooner than later. And you must think, if you have it in you, that you must be part of. Thank you very much.